Welcome to the Legal Talk podcast by LexisNexis. I'm Ali Dibin-Hall, the head of legal for Asia Pacific for LexisNexis. And in today's podcast, we're covering the impact of generative AI on lawyers, in particular on in-house legal teams. I'm delighted to welcome Ian McDougall, the Global General Counsel for LexisNexis, and Lindsay O'Connor, our General Manager of Content in Australia. Today, we're going to discuss the challenges that in-house legal teams face in the era of generative AI. We'll look at recent research into generative AI and how it's impacting the work done by in-house legal departments. We'll cover the questions in-house leaders are being asked by their businesses, their shareholders and stakeholders, and look at what many in-house leaders are considering, employing, or even implementing, even at this early stage. Alongside the opportunity to create efficiencies, we'll also take opportunity to talk about risk. What do you need to consider and how you can mitigate those risks? Hopefully, along the way, you'll find the answers to the sorts of questions you may need to be thinking about for your team, and we can provide insights around many of the questions you may need to be ready to answer when your business comes to you. So if we dive straight in, I'll direct this one first to Ian, and then I'll ask you your perspective. Ian, let's start with the basics. What does a high-functioning legal department look like, and how do you create efficiencies in your legal service delivery?
Yeah, so I'm going to really start with the basics. And what I mean by that is before you can start to answer some of these questions, you have to first decide what kind of legal department is going to be most effective for the organization that you're in. By which I mean, what is the object of the legal department in your particular company? It really starts from that simple consideration. So something that we did, for example, some time ago, was to do something that sounds very corporate-y, but I think is very useful. And we actually came up with a mission statement. And the mission statement is, it sounds a bit cliche, but the reason it's useful is because you can use it as a statement for what your legal department wants to achieve. What is its remit? What are the objectives of the legal department? This is like foundational stuff. Now, once you've got that and you understand both what the company expects of its legal department and what you need to deliver, then you can start thinking about organizational things. How should your legal department be structured? There are, in my view, no single in-house legal department. It's a mistake to kind of say in-house legal and think that covers everything. You've got legal departments which are very small, or sometimes even one person. Mm-hmm. You've got legal departments which have a small team. There are mid-sized legal departments, and there are huge legal departments. And the way that you run and operate those legal departments is quite different. Depends on the resourcing that you have. But either way, it comes back to what is that company expecting its legal department to do, and then you have to work out what's the most effective and efficient way of delivering that and how you should be resourced. There are a number of tools I can go into if you like about ways that you can do that, but I think really if you keep that in mind, that's your basic starting point.
I mean, we might as well start off with something practical, Ian. Yeah. So just give me one.
Yeah. So, for example, to think about Lean Six Sigma processes. Now, I know this comes as a blow to the egos of lawyers, but much of what the legal process is repeatable work. It's the same thing over and over and over again. And so when you get to the stage where you're doing the same thing over and over again, you have to realize that you've got a very high value, sometimes high cost legal resource doing something that has very little kind of high value input. So the way that we've tried to approach this is let's constantly try and find ways of taking the lower value work off of the desk of the lawyer and think of ways that we can do that differently. So that might mean automation. It might mean self-help. It might mean, as I said, Lean Six Sigma projects, which is how do I work out a process whereby this repeatable piece of work can be done over and over again in the most efficient and streamlined way. We, I think, came up with something which I haven't heard another legal department do. I think it's quite innovative to us, which is called the stop list. And the idea behind the stop list is that most companies are very good at adding responsibilities to people, adding tasks to what they have to do. What they're not so good at is taking away things that are no longer adding value. Again, a lot of the tasks which people do over a long period of time are tasks which are done simply because they have always been done. Well, if you can look back and say, well, does this task really no longer add any value? If so, I can stop doing it. I can literally just take it away. So these are, some of the things that can be used in order to help drive some efficiencies in the way that the legal team works.
Yeah, fantastic. I think my favorite example that I've heard you mention before is that sometimes when you're examining that stock list and things that might be applicable to go on it, you actually just stop and see if anyone notices.
Yeah, that's a really powerful tool as well. I mean, I can tell you from our experience, some years ago when I first became the General Counsel, we used to produce a huge number of reports, and they were PowerPoint, basically, which took a lot of time for people to do. And there was something like 40 or so that were being done every month, different reports. And so I just, at random, said to the team, take this report number 6 and report number 10, just don't do them and tell me who complains. Right? And you'd be surprised that nobody complained. The absence of that report, nobody missed it at all. So what does that tell you? That tells you that report's adding no value to anybody's work at all. And so we took the opportunity to start cutting back on things that really made no difference to the service that we were providing.
I think there's probably a few listeners who won't be entirely surprised by the fact no one noticed. Lindsay, I guess I wanted to talk to you about a broader perspective. Obviously, Ian's here at LexisNexis and my boss, so I won't ask him all the hard-hitting questions. But I'm wondering how what Ian is talking about accords with what you're seeing in the marketplace. I know you're talking to a lot of different in-house teams and associations and events and things like that. Is it the same sort of ethos and mission-driven sort of approach that you're seeing from those in-house teams and how they're trying to drive efficiencies in their organisations?
So first of all, I really like that Ian started off by mentioning something like Lean Six Sigma instead of jumping straight into kind of technology as a solution, because I think one of the easiest ways sometimes to actually drive these efficiencies is looking at those really practical steps that organizations can take. I think, and particularly at the moment, technology has somehow become synonymous with efficiency gains, but I think it shouldn't necessarily be the starting point. One of the things that I'm seeing when talking particularly to the in-house market is, again, just how varied it is. So, we have some incredibly tech-savvy, enthusiastic lawyers in that sector who are really looking to kind of drive adoption of technology in those organizations and are kind of pushing that and leading that in our organizations. And then, of course, there will be others at the opposite end of the scale who just aren't really sure where to start. And actually, for both those kind of categories of in-house lawyers, my advice would really be the same thing. And that is to start with your problem, start with your pain points. So really sit down and map out the key processes that exist in your team, map out what your key pain points as an organization are in the legal space, and then look at the range of different options available to you in terms of how to solve them. Sometimes it can just be these, quite simple, practical process efficiencies. But of course, there might be situations where it really makes sense to invest in solutions like technological solutions to try and solve those pain points. But what I see is that those lawyers who jump straight in the technology side of things because they feel like it's something that they should be doing, it's buzzword at the moment, everybody's talking about generative AI, they're keen to get stuck in. But if they do that without having a good idea of what they want to use it for and why they want to use it for that task, then ultimately they're probably going to either fail or fail to really extract the maximum benefit from doing it. So my advice always is start from the problem. And, if I think back to my days in the product world, that's very much how we start when we're looking at designing solutions, is what is the actual problem we're solving for here.
I think that's really interesting, Lindsay. While you were talking about defining the problem, one of the things that I was thinking about, and I know this is anathema to in-house lawyers, it gives me the creeps to say it, but One of the things that I think is really important is you have to focus on what's chewing up all the time in your team. Sometimes those are things that are valuable. Sometimes, often, they're things that aren't necessarily as valuable. And I think we all have, every time I go through this exercise with my team of temporary time recording, we identify new things that have crept in, to our processes or to our practices that are not really adding value to achieving that mission statement and aren't helping drive that efficiency. And I completely agree with you that there's not always a technology first approach that is actually going to give you the short-term gains that can lead into those longer-term efficiencies. Okay, so the next thing that I guess we've started to touch on already is about the disparity between the different types of in-house legal departments. Just like private practice, there are teams made of different numbers and different types of lawyers and different configurations and choices that organisations have made in how they're going to structure their legal resource. I guess the question I want to ask is, Ian, I'll ask you first and then we'll get a generalist perspective from Lindsay again. How does the structure and model of our in-house legal team at LexisNexis, how would you describe the structure of our team in terms of the concept of a generalist versus specialist model? And how does that impact the choices? How do the choices between generalist and specialist impact the choices you would then make in terms of using external counsel and the potential impact of AI tools?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you don't mind, I just want to take a minute to talk about how we thought about how to come up with the structure that we have. And that was basically an assessment of what are the categories of work that our company needs its legal team to look into. And you can sort of categorize it, and you categorize it by type and by volume. So basically you end up with this kind of pyramid structure where with at the bottom and at the broadest, you have potentially volume but low value. And at the very top, at the peak of the pyramid, you could have a small volume but very high impact or high risk kind of work. And so if you can imagine that as sort of, a graduated pyramid as you from the bottom to the top, you can then kind of make a decision about where you can most impact the legal service that the company needs. Are you going to be a small but specialist team dedicated to impacting the top of that pyramid? Or are you going to basically go to the middle of that pyramid and basically say, well, we're going to be much more generalist in the way that we do things. And for the really kind of bet the farm stuff, or for the real specialisms, that's the point at which we'll go outside. So we decided, looking at the nature of the work that the legal team was being asked to do, that we would sort of put ourselves in the kind of the risk band around about the middle. And to my mind, what that meant was a generalist model. And the way that I try to describe the generalist model by analogy is with your family doctor. And the idea behind that is that for your first port of call for everything that you need is the family doctor. That's the person that you go to first. And the family doctor in this analogy can deal with, say, 80% of your needs. And they'll write you the appropriate prescription, and most of the time that will be okay. And then for that other 20% are the times where you decide that actually some specialist is required, and your family doctor, in our case, the generalist legal person in-house, can then refer the situation to the appropriate specialist. Now, for us, that's a model that works, I think, particularly efficiently because most of the work sits in the middle of the band that I'm trying to describe. And so we basically would categorize the things that we send to outside counsel as basically being some massive project which requires a huge amount of temporary resource that can be deployed, litigation, very often that's handled outside, or some technical specialism that we don't have in-house. But by and large, the team on a generalist basis caters for most of what the business needs. And that's kind of how we have approached the way to structure the team. And, that would be potentially different depending on the nature of your organization. So, for example, I previously had experience working for a telecoms company. Now, the way that we organized that was actually in the reverse. So most of what we dealt with in the telecoms world was at the top of that pyramid, kind of very detailed, regulatory, high risk kind of stuff. And the bottom of the pyramid was the stuff that was outsourced. So it sort of depends upon, as I say, your things like your mission statement, the nature of the work, assessing the kind of things that your legal department most often has to deal with, and where you want to position that legal department to get maximum impact.
I do note that the one thing that you've glossed over there, Ian, is the unique benefit that we have being the in-house legal department of one of the world's major suppliers of legal information and technology.
That's true. I mean, we've got a pretty good research tool that we've got access to. That's true.
Okay. And Lindsay, I guess what are you seeing in the market in terms of, actually I'd be really interested to know how many teams you come across that are in that more generalist model versus the specialist model. Like I can see in a highly regulated environment like telcos, banking, those sorts of things, that there will be those highly specialized teams, or although I suspect some of those will also be behemoth legal teams. But what do you see in the market, Lindsay, about the way people are approaching how to structure their in-house teams?
And I think this is where it's so personal to individual firms. I was actually talking to an in-house lawyer last week, and she had a very interesting perspective on how they structure the kind of work they do in-house versus what they send out of house. And her view basically was, if she was needing specific legal advice, which was purely legal, then that would be something that she would send out to the external lawyers to provide a view on. However, wherever there was something she'd been asked to provide recommendation or guidance on to the organization, if it was a matter that really relied on that combination of knowledge of the business combined with knowledge of the law, then that would be something that they would retain internally. Because of course, the key benefit of your in-house legal team is that they don't just have that knowledge of the law, and often, depending where they've worked in private practice, they might have very specialist knowledge of particular areas of the law. But that thing they have that your external lawyers won't have is that real overview of the business, what its mission statement is, what the values are, what the kind of targets and KPIs for that year are. And really, they're there to then work with the business to help achieve all of those things. And so I find a lot of in-house teams kind of take that into account when they're making their decision-making process in terms of what they want to handle internally versus what they want to send out of house. I think as well, in-house legal teams also need to have a really great overview of the kind of work that they ideally want to do themselves in-house. So, sometimes circumstances mean that there is certain work that they're currently sending out, certain work they are doing themselves. But I definitely think at the moment, when we're on kind of the precipice of this, real adoption of technology being an enabler and changing the way that we do things, it's a great time for those in-house teams to sit down and think, what do we want to do in-house? What do we want to do ourselves? And what things, by the very nature of the work, such as litigation, will we always ensure is handled externally, for certain reasons? And then really to look at what do we as a team need to do to make that happen? Because of course, this could be a great opportunity for in-house teams to really look to change that structure and to make things work in an even better way to support their businesses. Once they've sort of identified the kind of work that they ideally would like to do in-house, that can also be a really great gateway for sort of horizon scanning and seeing what tools, what knowledge is out there to enable them to make that happen. Also, consideration of the key drivers for this. So, what are the aims of the legal team? Are they wanting to save on their external legal costs? Are they wanting to make sure their in-house legal teams are doing more interesting work? Are they wanting to ensure that those in-house lawyers are actually integrated more with the business and working more closely with people? So I think it's a good time to consider what are those drivers, and then it enables them to start this horizon scanning of how do we actually embark on that journey to get our team to where we want it to be in the coming years.
I think I can actually answer those questions for you, Lindsay. The answer is yes. Yes, they would like to reduce their external spend. Everybody wants to do more interesting work. The answer is yes. But I see what you mean about people prioritizing the focus. It's like the triangle that we all know about with, it's fast, cheap, and good, and you can only choose two points of the triangle. And so we all know that there are compromises that you have to make in order to be able to achieve whatever your primary goals are. So thinking about that, how can generative AI tools help in-house legal teams achieve their strategic goals, and help move lawyers up the value chain? Lindsay, can we build on your previous comments?
Absolutely. And, the exciting thing I think about the in-house legal market is, in my opinion, it's one of the sectors which I think stands to benefit the most out of all the different legal markets in this area from these tools. We know that the work done by in-house lawyers is quite particular because it's this real combination of legal work combined with that kind of business work. Also, when lawyers go in-house, particularly if they're moving from private practice, they will usually lose their access to resources like legal secretaries, paralegals, knowledge managers. So it means that you then have this kind of combination of incredibly time poor in-house lawyers, but who are by necessity having to do some of that lower value work because there simply isn't anybody else in the organization to support them with this work. And so for me, that means it's really exciting for the in-house market to see how they can really ensure that that lower value work can effectively be outsourced to some of the tools that are available for them. Now, at the moment, there is a whole raft of kind of tools available. And of course, it's for every individual organization to kind of assess what is going to be the best fit for them. But I have heard of some really interesting use cases from in-house lawyers about how they're already using some of these tools, such as Copilot and things, to help streamline the work they're doing. One of the key, I suppose, user cases for generative AI, because of the nature of what it is, effectively, these large language models are very good at language. So they're very good at producing content, producing language. Less good, as we'll see later, at certain other areas, such as accuracy, depending on how they've been trained and built. But if you look at their strengths, you can see that the ability to generate first drafts of legal documents or internal policies, generating internal educational materials. So I was speaking to an in-house lawyer a few weeks ago who's using these tools to actually generate PowerPoint presentations and things so that they can communicate that to their internal audience, on things such as competition law that they need to upskill their teams on. Also, things like actually proofreading that content. So once you've got initial drafts, checking for errors. The whole space of contracting, I think, is really ready to be, sort of completely changed by some of these tools and, not just streamlined, but also I think we'll see improvements in kind of accuracy and the quality of drafting in some cases. So again, some of these tools can be used for things such as reviewing huge quantities of documents and then actually extracting information from them. And that can sometimes be extracting quite sophisticated information. So extracting risk from large volumes of contracts so that that can be pulled together onto a risk register for the business, as well as more simple processes such as, extracting your various notice periods or, important dates in contracts and ensuring that that can be maintained in a schedule.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I feel like you've covered quite a field of all those different layers of in-house teams that we talked about who have different resources and different appetites for technology and things like that. There's kind of something in what you've said for everyone, because we all have to run training, we all have to review contracts, and then some of us are engaged in, large M&A sort of activity and things like that, where you might delve into those more sophisticated tools. But starting to just talk about how people can dip a toe in the generative AI water and just start to familiarize themselves with the technology in ways that can help them, I guess, move up the value chain in a really sort of easy to digest way. I've mixed a lot of metaphors, but that's okay. We'll go with it. Ian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I suppose, and I don't know whether you think this is appropriate now to talk about the nature of the AI tools that are available. So first of all, I think it's important to realize that I've used the word tool there as opposed to panacea or something similar. And so I do strongly believe that the drive for efficiency is a constant, never-ending one, and all of the other things that I've mentioned are really important. And generative AI is a tool to help you achieve where you're going. It's not the solution to all of your problems. It's a tool to help you become more effective, more efficient, and to drive the legal department, where you're going. But the risks are apparent and I think are increasingly well known. But these risks come about because I believe that there are two types of generative AI model. There's what I call open AI and closed AI. Open AI is things like that you have access to now on the open web and that practically everybody can use. But the problem about that is that those models have been trained on everything that's out there in the open web, including all of the bias, all of the errors, all of the nonsense that's out there. And they don't really distinguish very much from all of that nonsense, because ultimately it's a statistical model. And the more nonsense that you get into the system, the more likely the AI model is to believe that that's the appropriate answer to the question that's being asked. Whereas a closed AI model is one where the AI has been trained on a specific data set, a limited specific data set, for the purpose of answering questions or whatever it may be related to that data set. And that's quite a different thing. So as I've mentioned before, with OpenAI, we're aware of things like hallucinations, which is where the AI is literally making up an answer. And it does it because when it can't find a specific fact, it now defaults to its statistical language model and makes the most likely language connections. Whether that's true or not is another thing, but that's what it does. Whereas when you're dealing with a specific data set, let's take, for example, the LexisNexis database. What we're doing is training the AI, the large language model, specifically on the Lexis database. So if I were to ask an open AI model who won the Football World Cup in 1966, it's got a fair chance of giving me an answer. But a large language model that's trained purely on the data set that we give it should be able to say to you, I don't know. I've not been trained for that. That's not the kind of question I've been asked. And I'm not going to make up an answer either. I just don't know, because that's all it's been trained to do. So the risks that we are seeing, which have become apparent already, are lawyers, for example, relying upon an open AI model to produce things like pleadings and other documents for the court, realizing too late that it's produced hallucination, which has now got them into trouble for misleading the court. Some of them, I'm sure, are going to be struck off at some point, but that's because of the nature of open as opposed to closed AI. And so my suggestion, my proposal, is that if you are going to use AI in a professional context, what you should be using is professionally trained AI and not open AI. And that's the biggest risk, I think, at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Now that we've scared everyone, I am going to go over to Lindsay. And Lindsay, as well as the risks, what do you think the opportunities for AI? Because I know that was a very big question. Sorry, I will narrow it. I mean, in terms of, let's think about these in-house legal teams, and they're obviously thinking about how to implement generative AI within their teams and how it can be used to improve the services of the legal department. But they're also going to be asked to advise on the risks and opportunities of generative AI for the businesses. In fact, I would 100% expect most people who are listening to this have already been asked that question. We get asked it all the time. So what are you seeing in the market, I guess, about the types of questions and queries that people are getting from their businesses and how they're approaching managing those risks and opportunities? Because nobody wants to miss out on the benefits, but also nobody wants to be the poor guy who submits the pleading with the hallucination.
Absolutely. And look, as lawyers, it's absolutely natural that the first place people's minds move towards is what those risks are. And actually, that's a great starting point because I think from the outset, if you're considering using any of these tools, be they open or closed, it's really important to educate yourself and have an awareness of what those risks are up front. And then you can start to discuss how, as an organization, you put in place strategies to kind of manage that risk. Now, every organization is going to have a different risk appetite. And I know there's lots of companies out there that have just simply banned the use of these tools, which I think is a shame because, as we saw earlier, there is huge scope, particularly in in-house legal, to really drive efficiency gains in this area. So I think it's, a real missed opportunity if anybody's just banning people from looking at these tools. But you do need to establish right from the outset what these guardrails are. If you're using any AI tools, but particularly open AI tools, there are a few key things that you can do upfront to sort of protect yourself and to protect your usage of those tools. The first thing is that any responses provided by these tools should only ever be a starting point for you. And so you've got to absolutely make sure that you're fact checking any responses that come through and then applying your own expertise and professional judgment to those responses. Ian also mentioned currency, and currency is, a big fear of some of these tools, particularly the ones that are currently freely available. And they're often only current up to a particular point in time. So you absolutely need to make sure you're aware of what that date is and that you have strategy in place to cover those currency gaps. One of the big concerns for organizations is obviously around privacy and data security. And that's always going to be a risk if you've got people in your organization using the tools. As a general rule, you need to make sure that nobody is uploading any kind of sensitive or proprietary information into these tools, certainly no customer data, but also content that your organization might hold that's specific to yourself, internal reports and things like that. That absolutely shouldn't be uploaded into these models. The various large language models have different terms of service, and some of those, will use that information to train the models. Some of them won't, but as a general rule, it's just best to make sure that people kind of aren't doing that. In terms of some of the kind of practical steps that I've seen organizations take, one of the kind of starting points is policies, right? Every organization loves to have a policy. And so a lot of organizations are starting out by drafting AI use policies. And that's a good starting point, but there's no point in having a policy that just sits on the shelf unread and people aren't educated on it. So I think in tandem with having that policy, you need to look at a program of education for your organization as well on what that policy means and practically what that means for people, not just, sort of a blanket ban. One of the other things that I've seen a couple of organizations do really successfully is to establish internal kind of working groups. So either a technology or specific AI working group. I was invited to go and talk to one the other week, and it was really interesting because the working group was made up of a variety of different people, from some of the junior lawyers to the senior legal counsel of the organization. Some of them had a lot of knowledge about AI and some really no knowledge at all. And they were all there coming together to really look at opportunities specifically for the legal organization, but also for the rest of the business to kind of use these tools. And particularly, they were at the stage of kind of gathering user cases and exploring what some of those opportunities might be. And I think the other thing really for organizations who are open-minded about these tools and who are really looking to drive benefits in the future is to look at this as a kind of change management program, right? So this is a big change for a lot of people, particularly those people who haven't up until now been too aware of some of these developments. And so what you really want to do is kind of foster a culture of innovation within your team, within your organization. And you can do that by establishing early on some guardrails. So, some upfront rules and guardrails that kind of protect you and your team, whilst also enabling the team to kind of start to experiment with some of these tools in a safe environment. and then really review, the learnings and share them with the broader organization. That can help you, work out what some of these use cases are, but it can also help you if it comes to the point at which you're wanting to invest in things like potentially a technology solution. It can be really, really hard for legal teams in-house to demonstrate an ROI on this kind of investment. Often it's approved by the CFO, who can be quite disconnected from the legal function. So, having these experiments in place can really help you pull together that data on what some of these benefits for the organization can be as well, so that, when you're ready to, you're able to kind of get the support to invest in some of these tools.
Great. I think the change management piece is so key, that the people don't know what they don't know, and everybody's so excited about all of this new technology and what it may mean for them and their teams and for their businesses. And there can be a tendency for some people to run ahead and some people to retreat into their little turtle shells. And we've got to find organisations and legal teams, we've got to find ways of managing that change and bringing all of those people along at a pace that we can manage. Ian, did you have more you wanted to add on how to advise particularly stakeholders on those risks and opportunities?
That's something that I think is very similar to how you advise your stakeholders on any kind of risk that the business is running into. I think to a large extent, that depends on the nature of the relationship that the legal department has with its senior stakeholders. But I don't think that there is any question that the legal departments here have an opportunity to take a leadership role within their organizations on the use and risks that AI can bring, for example, losing your intellectual property and things like that. So I don't have any specific advice on how they go about doing it, but I think what we've been talking about during the course of this discussion encapsulates all of the things that they need to be thinking about when advising their respective client or stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you. I think this conversation to me has been really covered. We've covered a broad range of topics and we've covered a few, I think, pretty key concepts. I think one of the points that I think is a key takeaway from this is how much, and I'm not trying to scare anyone listening to this podcast, but how much we as lawyers actually need to understand generative AI. You don't need to know how it works. You don't need to know what's in the box. As far as I can tell, the technologists aren't really sure what's in the box, but we need to be able to understand it and come to grips with it so that we can actually properly advise our businesses and also make sensible decisions about how to, or if to implement it within our teams. But the other key message I think that I'm taking away from this is about the incremental change. Yes, this is a big thing. Yes, it is probably going to change the shape of work as we know it in the sort of medium term. But there are still changes that people can find and implement in their organizations that can help prepare them for the next step of generative AI and can keep moving the needle for their team and for their organization without necessarily having to take that big leap right now.
Yeah, I mean, if I can say, I think our legal department has been on an efficiency drive for at least the last 10 years. And my recommendation would be to start with the idea that that's what you're looking for. You're looking for efficiencies, improvements, quality, all those kind of things. And that the generative AI is one of a number of tools that you can use to deliver that kind of service to the business. Now, I think it's a mistake if you are looking at generative AI and thinking, well, that's going to solve all my problems. All I have to do is deploy this tool, and by some miracle of technology, we're going to have a super efficient legal team. I don't think it's going to work that way. I think you need to look at the problem holistically, and generative AI is part of the solution.
Well, now that Ian's had some last words, I wouldn't want to show any favoritism. So, Lindsay, any last words that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
I mean, similar to what Ian just said, and to sort of repeat something I said right at the outset, start with the problem. So make sure that if you're really looking to adopt these tools, you're looking to use them for a specific reason rather than expecting the tool to solve all of your problems, because it isn't going to do that.
No miracles here. So thank you to you both for talking us through how generative AI is impacting in-house legal departments and providing us with some insights as to where we can expect to go next. Obviously, significant changes lie ahead of all of us, so we'll all be watching this space with great interest over the coming few months and years to see how things play out. We hope that all of our listeners have enjoyed listening to this podcast as much as we've enjoyed putting it together for you. If you're interested in learning more, you can visit the Insights page on the LexisNexis website. You may also like to join our AI Insiders program and be among the first of your peers to gain early access to insights and to try new legal AI tools which fuel your team's performance. Follow the links on the podcast page to learn more.